The morning of December 18th, 1944, outside the Belgian village of Krinkelt, a German anti-tank crew settled into position behind their 88mm Park 43. The gun was a monster, over 16 feet long, its barrel capable of hurling a 22-pound armor-piercing shell at nearly 3,000 feet per second. Frost clung to the metal. The crew's breath came in white clouds. They had been awake since 3 in the morning, part of the massive German counter-offensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. Oberfeldwebel Klaus Richter commanded the gun. He was 26 years old, a veteran of the Eastern Front who had destroyed 11 Soviet tanks at Kursk. To him and his crew, the 88 was not just a weapon, it was certainty itself. In 2 years of combat, Richter had never seen armor that could withstand a direct hit at combat range. Not the Soviet 34, not the British Churchill, and certainly not the American Sherman, that rolling coffin the Germans called a Tommy cooker. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Through the early morning fog, Richter spotted movement. 300 meters down the forest road, a Sherman tank emerged from the tree line. Standard procedure. His gunner, Gefreiter Hans Müller, already had the traverse wheel spinning, bringing the long barrel to bear. The loader slammed an armor-piercing round into the breech. The entire sequence took 11 seconds. They had done this so many times that words were unnecessary. Müller centered the crosshairs on the Sherman's hull, just below the turret ring where the armor was thinnest on American tanks. Richter gave the command. The 88 roared, its concussion rattling equipment and sending a wave of overpressure across the frozen ground. The shell crossed the distance in less than a third of a second. It bounced. The crew saw the bright spark of impact, the shell deflecting upward at a steep angle and disappearing into the grey sky. For a moment, no one spoke. Müller blinked through his optics, certain he had misjudged the range or the angle, but the data was correct. 300 meters, near perpendicular to the target, a textbook shot. The Sherman kept coming. Richter ordered another round. The loader was already moving, his hands automatic despite the confusion in his mind. The breech clanged shut. Müller fired again. This time they all watched the impact point with absolute focus. The shell struck the Sherman's glacis plate dead center. Again, the spark. Again, the deflection. The projectile that should have penetrated 4 inches of armor and turned the crew inside to fragments simply skipped off the hull like a stone across water. The Sherman's turret began to traverse toward them. What Klaus Richter and his crew did not know, could not have known, was that they were facing one of only 254 M4A3E2 assault tanks ever built. The Americans called it the Jumbo. Its frontal armor was not the 2 inches of a standard Sherman, nor even the 4 inches of the later models. In key areas, accounting for angle and applique plates, it approached 7 inches of hardened steel. The 88mm Pak 43, the gun that had defined armoured warfare on the Western Front, had just met its match. The question was not whether the crew would survive the next 30 seconds. The question was how many other German gunners would face this impossible Sherman before someone in intelligence believed them. To understand the shock of that moment outside Krinkelt, one must understand what the 88mm gun meant to the German Wehrmacht. It was not simply a weapon, it was a philosophy made steel, the physical manifestation of German tactical superiority that had defined 3 years of armoured combat. The Flak 18, the original 88, had been designed in the early 1930s as an anti-aircraft gun. Its high muzzle velocity, necessary to reach bombers at altitude, gave it extraordinary penetrating power against ground targets. During the Spanish Civil War, German Condor Legion crews discovered they could destroy Republican tanks with ease. The lesson was not lost on Wehrmacht planners. By 1940, the 88 had been adapted for dedicated anti-tank work. The Pak 43, introduced in 1943, pushed performance even further. Its tungsten core ammunition could penetrate 6 inches of armor at 1,000 meters. At typical combat ranges of 300 to 500 meters, it could defeat any Allied tank in service. British Churchills, with their thick infantry support armour, were vulnerable. Soviet 34s, praised for their sloped design, offered no protection. And American Shermans were, by all accounts, death traps. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The statistics were brutal and well documented. A 1944 US Army study found that German 88mm guns accounted for roughly 30% of all Sherman losses in Normandy, despite representing less than 10% of German anti-tank weapons. The guns' effective range exceeded 2,000 meters, allowing German crews to engage Allied armor before American 75mm guns could respond. The kill-to-loss ratio was devastating. For every 88mm anti-tank gun destroyed, German crews claimed an average of 7 Allied tanks. German crews knew these numbers. More importantly, they felt them. The confidence that came from operating the 88 was absolute. Training emphasized this superiority. Gunnery instructors taught that the only challenge was hitting the target, not penetrating it. Doctrine assumed that any Allied tank, once struck, was destroyed. After-action reports reinforced this assumption month after month, battle after battle. This psychological certainty extended beyond the gun crews themselves. German infantry knew that if an 88 was in position, Allied armor could not advance. Commanders built defensive plans around the gun's capabilities, positioning them at key crossroads and along likely approach routes. The mere presence of an 88, even if camouflaged and silent, could halt an Allied advance. Tankers feared them. Intelligence officers hunted for them. Artillery prioritized their destruction. By late 1944, as Germany's situation grew desperate, the 88 represented one of the few technological advantages the Wehrmacht still possessed. German tank production lagged far behind Allied output. The Panther and Tiger tanks, though formidable, were complex and prone to mechanical failure. But the 88, whether mounted on a tank destroyer or used as a towed anti-tank gun, remained reliable, effective, and psychologically dominant. American tankers called them murder guns. British crews referred to them as widowmakers. Soviet reports described positions defended by 88s as death zones. The gun had earned these names through 3 years of consistent performance. It had destroyed more Allied armor than any other German weapon system. And in December of 1944, as the Wehrmacht launched its final desperate offensive in the Ardennes, the 88 crews rolled forward with the confidence of men who had never been proven wrong. That confidence was about to shatter. While German gunners operated with supreme confidence, American tank crews entered combat in 1944, burdened by a very different psychology. They climbed into their M4 Sherman tanks, knowing, with statistical certainty, that they were outmatched. The Sherman was not designed to fight German heavy armor. It was designed to be produced in quantities that German industry could never match. This was sound, strategic doctrine, but it provided little comfort to the men inside the steel boxes. The Sherman's frontal armor, in its most common variant, measured 2 inches on the hull and 3 inches on the turret. Later models, like the M4A1 with the 76mm gun, increased this to approximately 4 inches on the glacis plate when accounting for its 47-degree slope. These numbers were adequate against most German tanks and all German anti-tank guns of 1942 and early 1943, but by late 1944 they were dangerously obsolete. A German 88mm Pak-43 could penetrate 4 inches of armor at 1,500 meters. The Sherman's frontal protection could be defeated at ranges where American gunners could not effectively return fire. The German Panther tank, armed with a long-barreled 75mm gun, could destroy a Sherman from the front at 1,000 meters while remaining effectively immune to the Sherman's gun at the same range. The Tiger, with its 88mm KOK-36, represented an even more extreme mismatch. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. American tactical doctrine acknowledged this reality with brutal honesty. Training manuals instructed Sherman crews to avoid frontal engagements with German heavy armor whenever possible. The preferred tactic was to use numerical superiority, maneuver to flank positions, and attack from the sides or rear where German armor was thinnest. Official doctrine suggested that it took 5 Shermans to reliably destroy 1 Panther. Crews shortened this to a grim joke: 4 Shermans to distract the Panther, 1 to get around behind. The nickname Ronson or Tommy Cooker reflected the Sherman's tendency to catch fire when penetrated. Early models stored ammunition in sponsons along the hull sides, directly in the path of penetrating shells. A hit often ignited propellant charges, causing catastrophic internal fires. Crews had approximately 30 seconds to evacuate before temperatures inside reached lethal levels. Many didn't make it. Later variants moved ammunition storage below the turret basket and added water jackets for fire suppression, but the reputation persisted. Casualty statistics reinforced these fears. A 1944 study by the 3rd Armoured Division found that 62% of tank crew casualties occurred in the first 30 days of combat. New crews, unfamiliar with proper tactical employment, suffered disproportionately, but even experienced crews faced grim odds. The average operational lifespan of a Sherman in heavy combat was measured in weeks, sometimes days. Crews were rotated through replacement tanks with disturbing frequency. Yet, Shermans kept coming. American industrial capacity produced nearly 50,000 M4 variants during the war. German factories managed approximately 6,000 Panthers and 1,300 Tigers in the same period. The Sherman's mechanical reliability, ease of maintenance, and logistical simplicity meant that American armor formations could sustain operations indefinitely. German heavy tanks, though superior in firepower and protection, spent more time awaiting spare parts than engaging the enemy. This created a paradox in American armor doctrine. Strategically, the Sherman was winning the war through sheer numbers and sustainability. Tactically, individual crews faced terrifying odds every time they encountered German heavy weapons. The tankers who fought in Normandy, who pushed through the hedgerows and engaged Panthers at point-blank range, understood that their survival depended not on armor, but on speed, concealment, and the hope that the next German gun would miss. Into this environment, in the summer of 1944, arrived 254 tanks that broke every assumption about American armor. They were Shermans in name and silhouette, but their armor protection rivaled German heavy tanks. The designation was M4A3E2. The crews simply called them jumbos. And for reasons rooted in secrecy, limited production, and rushed deployment, German intelligence never learned they existed until it was far too late. The M4A3E2 assault tank emerged not from deliberate planning, but from desperate necessity recognized in the spring of 1944. As Allied planners prepared for the invasion of Normandy, intelligence reports painted a concerning picture. German forces had fortified the French coast with extensive defensive works, concrete bunkers, reinforced strong points, and layered anti-tank obstacles. Breaking through these defences would require armour capable of leading infantry assaults while absorbing punishment that would destroy standard tanks. The problem reached the desk of Major General Gladion Barnes, Chief of the Army Ordnance Department's Research and Development Service. His solution was elegantly simple: take the proven Sherman chassis and add as much armour as the suspension could physically bear. No radical redesign, no lengthy testing period. Just raw, additional steel welded onto existing hulls. The Fisher Tank Arsenal in Grand Blanc, Michigan, received the contract in May of 1944. Engineers calculated that the M4A3 chassis, with its Ford GAA Vate engine producing 500 horsepower, could support an additional 9 tons of armour without catastrophic mechanical failure. The base hull armour was doubled. The glacis plate received an additional 1.5 inches of face-hardened steel, bringing total thickness to approximately 5.5 inches at a 47-degree angle. This created an effective thickness of roughly 7 inches against direct fire. The turret received even more dramatic enhancement. The frontal casting was increased to 7 inches of solid steel. The mantlet, protecting the gun mount, measured nearly 8 inches at its thickest point. Side armor increased from 1.5 inches to 3 inches. Even the tracks received protective skirts to shield the suspension from hollow charge weapons. Weight increased from 33 tons to 42 tons. Top speed decreased from 30 miles per hour to approximately 22. The power-to-weight ratio, already marginal on standard Shermans, dropped to 14 horsepower per ton. This made the jumbo sluggish in acceleration and poor at climbing steep grades. But none of this mattered if the armor worked. Production began in June of 1944 and concluded by July. The limited run of 254 tanks reflected both the urgency of the project and the limitations of the approach. Each jumbo required approximately 12 tons of additional steel at a time when every pound of armor plate was allocated to competing priorities. The decision was made to produce a small number of specialized assault tanks rather than marginally improve a larger fleet. The initial 75mm M3 gun was retained, a decision that would prove controversial. Ordnance officers argued that the jumbo's role was to absorb fire and create breaches, not engage enemy armor at long range. The shorter, lower velocity 75 had better high explosive performance for bunker busting. But this meant that jumbo crews possessed extraordinary protection while carrying a gun inadequate for the heavy German tanks they would inevitably encounter. The first jumbos reached Europe in late July of 1944, weeks after the Normandy landings. They were distributed in small numbers across multiple armoured divisions rather than concentrated in dedicated units. The 2nd Armoured Division received 30. The 3rd Armoured Division received 34. The 4th Armoured Division, which would later spearhead Patton's drive across France, received 22. This dispersal meant that most American tankers never saw a jumbo. Most German intelligence officers never captured one intact. Crucially, no formal doctrine existed for employing the jumbo. Company commanders received tanks with armor specifications that seemed almost fantastical, but no training on how to exploit them. Some used jumbos as spearheads for urban assault. Others positioned them as mobile pillboxes in defensive positions. A few enterprising commanders placed them at point-in-column advances, trusting the armor to survive the first German ambush and reveal enemy positions. The crews themselves were standard Sherman tankers, not specially selected or trained. They learned their tanks' capabilities through trial and error, often under fire. The weight difference was immediately apparent. The jumbo accelerated slowly, struggled in mud, and consumed fuel at an alarming rate. But in direct combat, the armor performed beyond expectations. Crews reported hits from German anti-tank guns that would have destroyed standard Shermans, but merely left dents and scorch marks on the jumbo's hull. Word spread informally through the ranks. Certain Sherman tanks, identical in silhouette to standard models, were nearly invulnerable from the front. But the information remained anecdotal, confined to American formations. German intelligence, already overwhelmed by the collapse of France and the need to track hundreds of Allied units, never identified the jumbo as a distinct variant requiring special tactical consideration. The failure of German intelligence to identify the jumbo Sherman represents one of the war's most consequential oversights. It was not the result of incompetence, but rather the natural consequence of a military intelligence apparatus that had been systematically degraded by 3 years of losses, strategic overextension, and the cumulative effects of Allied counterintelligence operations. By late 1944, German military intelligence, the Fremde Heere West, or Foreign Armies West, operated under conditions of near blindness. The Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, had been compromised by Allied double agents and absorbed into the SS earlier that year. Long-range reconnaissance aircraft, essential for gathering tactical intelligence on Allied movements, had been swept from the skies by overwhelming Allied air superiority. The Luftwaffe could barely protect German cities, much less conduct systematic reconnaissance of Allied rear areas where new equipment would first appear. Human intelligence networks in England and France had been systematically dismantled. The success of Operation Fortitude, the Allied deception plan for D-Day, demonstrated just how thoroughly German intelligence had been penetrated and manipulated. Officers who had once confidently assessed Allied capabilities now operated on fragments, rumours, and outdated information. They knew the Americans were producing tanks in vast quantities. They knew the British were introducing new variants with improved guns. But the details, the specifications that would allow tactical adaptation, remained elusive. The Jumbo's limited production numbers worked in favour of secrecy. 254 tanks represented less than 0.5% of total Sherman production. Distributed across multiple divisions on a front that stretched from the Swiss border to the North Sea, they appeared with such rarity that initial sightings were dismissed as anomalies. A German anti-tank crew reporting that an 88mm shell had bounced off a Sherman was more likely to be accused of missing the target than believed to have encountered a new variant. Moreover, the Jumbo's external appearance closely matched standard Shermans. Unlike the British Churchill or the Soviet IS-2, which were visually distinct heavy tanks, the Jumbo retained the familiar Sherman silhouette. At combat ranges of 300 to 500 meters, often through smoke, vegetation, or poor weather, German gunners had seconds to identify targets. The training that had served them well for 3 years, Sherman equals thin armor equals easy kill, now betrayed them. The few Jumbos that were destroyed and examined provided misleading data. If a Jumbo was knocked out by a hit to the side or rear, where armor remained relatively thin, examiners would note standard Sherman construction. If a Jumbo was disabled by mechanical failure or abandoned, stripping crews prioritized weapons, optics, and radio equipment over carefully measuring armor thickness. The incremental nature of the armor increase meant that field measurements might show variations without revealing the systematic enhancement. German tactical doctrine compounded the problem. By late 1944, Wehrmacht defensive tactics emphasized mobility, ambush, and withdrawal over static positions. Anti-tank guns were positioned to engage flanks and rears, not to fight frontal duels. When a Jumbo did appear and survive frontal hits, German crews often assumed they had misjudged the angle or range, rather than questioning their fundamental assumptions about American armor. The absence of captured documents proved critical. Allied security classifications kept Jumbo specifications tightly controlled. Unlike standard Shermans, whose technical manuals had been captured throughout 1943 and 44, no Jumbo manual fell into German hands. American crews were instructed to destroy documentation if capture seemed imminent. The few Jumbos lost intact were typically recovered by American forces before German intelligence teams could conduct thorough examinations. Perhaps most significantly, the timing of the Jumbo's deployment coincided with Germany's broader strategic collapse. In the summer and fall of 1944, German forces were reeling from catastrophic losses in Operation Bagration on the Eastern Front, the collapse of Army Group Centre, the failed Falaise pocket in France, and the loss of Romania's oil fields. Intelligence resources focused on identifying threats to Germany's survival, Soviet offensives, Allied airborne operations, and the anticipated invasion across the Rhine. A slightly better armoured Sherman variant, appearing in small numbers on a front where hundreds of Allied tanks operated, simply did not register as a priority concern. Intelligence summaries from September through November of 1944 make no mention of enhanced Sherman armour. Tactical bulletins warned of improved Allied anti-tank weapons and air superiority, but continued to assess American tanks as vulnerable to German anti-tank guns at standard combat ranges. This intelligence failure created a profound psychological weapon. When German crews encountered Jumbos and watched their rounds bounce, they experienced not just tactical surprise but cognitive dissonance. The 88mm gun, the weapon that had never failed them, suddenly appeared unreliable. Crews questioned their own competence. Had they loaded the wrong ammunition? Was the gun defective? The alternative, that American armor had achieved parity with German heavy tanks, seemed impossible. By the time German intelligence began receiving consistent reports of heavily armored Shermans in December of 1944, the Battle of the Bulge had begun. In the chaos of Germany's final offensive, with entire divisions cut off and communications fragmentary, systematic intelligence gathering became impossible. Individual units adapted as they could, but no army-wide tactical directive addressed the jumbo threat. The gap between reality and German expectations would persist until the war's end. The full psychological impact of the jumbo Sherman crystallized during the opening days of the Battle of the WWII, Bulge, when German tactical assumptions collided with American armor that refused to behave according to doctrine. The engagement outside Krinkelt was not isolated. Across the Ardennes front, from Monschau in the north to Echternach in the south, 88mm crews faced a bewildering new reality. On the morning of December 17, 1944, elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division encountered jumbos from Company B, 33rd Armoured Regiment, 3rd Armoured Division, near the Belgian town of Butgenbach. The German force included 5 Tiger tanks and multiple Park 43 anti-tank guns, positioned to ambush American reinforcements moving toward the breakthrough sector. The ground favored the defenders, open fields with minimal cover, forcing Allied armor to advance along predictable routes. 3 jumbos led the American column. Standard doctrine would have been suicidal. The Tigers and anti-tank guns had clear fields of fire exceeding 1,000 meters, but the jumbo commanders, having learned their tanks' capabilities through previous engagements, advanced with confidence. The German guns opened fire at 800 meters. The first Tiger's 88mm round struck the lead jumbo's glacis plate at a slight angle. The shell penetrated the outer appliqué layer but failed to breach the base armor. The impact sent a shockwave through the crew compartment, stunning the driver, but the tank continued forward. The Tiger crew, confused by the survival of their target, fired again. The second round hit the turret front. Again, no penetration. The jumbo's gunner, now oriented on the Tiger's muzzle flash, returned fire. The 75mm round, inadequate for frontal penetration of a Tiger's armor, nevertheless struck the German tank's gun mantlet with sufficient force to jam the traverse mechanism. Effectively mission killed, the Tiger withdrew. The remaining German armor, watching a Sherman absorb multiple 88mm hits and continue fighting, hesitated. That hesitation cost them initiative. The engagement devolved into a chaotic close-range fight as American infantry and additional Shermans, both standard and jumbo variants, pushed into the German position. By noon, the German force had withdrawn, having destroyed 2 standard Shermans but failed to stop the armoured column. The 3 jumbos that led the assault bore multiple impact marks on their hulls and turrets. Not one had been penetrated from the front. A similar pattern repeated across the Bulge salient. Near Bastogne, a single jumbo from the 4th Armoured Division's 37th Tank Battalion held a crossroads against repeated German attacks on December 20th. The tank, commanded by Staff Sergeant William McVeigh, absorbed 17 anti-tank rounds over 6 hours. German forces, convinced they were facing a fixed fortification rather than a mobile tank, eventually bypassed the position rather than continue expending ammunition uselessly. The psychological effects rippled through German formations. After-action reports from the 6th Panzer Army, obtained from captured documents, reveal growing confusion about American armor capabilities. One report from late December stated, "Enemy tank variants observed with improved frontal protection. 88mm penetration, unreliable at ranges below 500 meters. Recommend targeting tracks and flanks exclusively. The language is significant." German tactical doctrine had never described 88mm penetration as unreliable. The weapon's effectiveness had been assumed, not questioned. The recommendation to target tracks and flanks represented a fundamental shift in tactical thinking, an admission that frontal engagement was no longer guaranteed to succeed. For American crews, the jumbo provided not just physical protection but psychological liberation. Tankers, who had spent months accepting that their survival depended on luck and maneuver, suddenly possessed armor that could stand and fight. This confidence translated into tactical aggression. Jumbos were pushed forward into positions where standard Shermans would have been withdrawn. They served as rallying points for infantry, as mobile cover for advancing troops, and as psychological weapons whose mere presence altered German tactical calculations. Yet the Jumbo's limitations remained stark. Side armour, though improved to 3 inches, remained vulnerable to German 75mm and 88mm guns at typical combat ranges. Rear armour, at 1.5 inches, could be penetrated by even lighter anti-tank weapons. The reduced mobility made Jumbos vulnerable to flanking manoeuvres and difficult to extract if terrain became unfavourable. Moreover, the 75mm gun meant that Jumbos could not reliably engage German heavy armour frontally. A Jumbo facing a Tiger or Panther in open terrain possessed armour superiority, but firepower inferiority. The engagement became a test of nerves. Could the Jumbo close to point-blank range, where the 75 might find weak points in German armour, or would the superior German gun eventually land a side or turret shot that negated the Jumbo's protection? The answer depended on terrain, crew skill, and often pure chance. But the fact that such engagements became tactical puzzles, rather than certain American losses, represented a revolutionary shift. For 3 years, American armor doctrine had accepted inferiority in individual tank versus tank combat. The Jumbo, in limited numbers and with significant compromises, challenged that assumption. Not enough to change the war's outcome, but enough to change how tankers fought and how German gunners aimed. The Jumbo Sherman's combat record through the winter of 1944 and into 1945 revealed both its extraordinary strengths and its inherent limitations. As the Battle of the Bulge ground toward its conclusion in late January, American armored divisions compiled after-action reports that attempted to quantify what crews had experienced viscerally. The Jumbo could survive, but survival alone did not guarantee victory. Casualty statistics told a striking story. Standard M4 Shermans in heavy combat during the Bulge suffered loss rates approaching 40% in some battalions. Jumbos, operating in identical conditions and often leading the same attacks, experienced loss rates below 15%. The difference was almost entirely attributable to frontal armor protection. When Jumbos were knocked out, post-battle analysis consistently showed hits to sides, rear, or catastrophic mechanical failure rather than frontal penetration. But these numbers concealed a more complex tactical reality. The Jumbo's limited firepower meant it could not decisively engage German heavy armor. In engagements where Jumbos faced Panthers or Tigers, the typical outcome was stalemate or withdrawal rather than American victory. The Jumbo could survive the encounter, allowing its crew to live and fight another day, but it could not kill the German tank that had failed to kill it. This limitation drove urgent field modifications. Beginning in January of 1945, some Jumbos received 76mm guns scavenged from destroyed standard Shermans. The conversion was unofficial, performed by maintenance units using whatever resources they could improvise. The longer, higher-velocity 76mm gave Jumbos a fighting chance against German heavy armor at ranges where their superior frontal protection could be exploited. Approximately 40 to 50 Jumbos received this upgrade, though exact numbers remain uncertain due to the informal nature of the modifications. Crews praised the results. A Jumbo with a 76mm gun could fight Panthers nearly as an equal, possessing comparable armor protection and adequate firepower. Against Tigers, the matchup remained difficult, but no longer hopeless. These hybrid Jumbos represented what American armor doctrine had needed since Normandy, a tank that could both survive and kill in direct combat with German heavies. Yet even as these modifications proceeded, the strategic context was shifting. By February of 1945, German resistance in the West was collapsing. The failure of the Ardennes offensive had consumed Germany's last mobile reserves. Fuel shortages immobilized even undamaged German tanks. Allied air superiority meant that German armour could barely move during daylight hours. The tactical problem that the jumbo had been designed to solve, breaking through prepared German defences, was being solved instead by overwhelming numerical and logistical superiority. The jumbo's psychological impact, however, persisted beyond its tactical utility. German gunners who had encountered the heavily armoured Shermans carried that experience into subsequent engagements. The absolute confidence that had characterized 88mm crews earlier in the war was replaced by caution and uncertainty. Intelligence briefings in February and March of 1945 finally acknowledged the existence of heavily armoured Sherman variants, but by then the warnings came too late to influence German tactical doctrine in any meaningful way. For American tankers, the jumbo's existence provided something more valuable than its limited numbers suggested: proof that American industry could produce armour equal to German standards when required. The narrative that American tanks were inherently inferior, that crews had to accept vulnerability as the price of mobility and reliability, was definitively shattered. Later American tank designs, including the M26 Pershing heavy tank that arrived in small numbers in early 1945, reflected lessons learned from the jumbo program. The jumbo also influenced post-war armour doctrine. The tension between protection, firepower, and mobility that the jumbo embodied became central to American tank design philosophy. The recognition that crews needed protection sufficient to survive the opening moments of engagement, even at the cost of speed or range, shaped development of the M46, M47, and ultimately the M48 Patton tanks that dominated American armoured forces through the 1950s. But perhaps the jumbo's most significant legacy was symbolic. It represented American industrial flexibility, the capacity to identify a problem, develop a solution, and field it in quantities sufficient to matter, all within months rather than years. The fact that only 254 were built might seem insignificant against total Sherman production exceeding 49,000. But those 254 tanks appeared exactly when needed, performed exactly as required, and survived at rates that saved hundreds of American lives. The crews who fought in jumbos carried their experience into peacetime. Veterans' accounts consistently emphasized the confidence that came from knowing their armor could protect them, the aggression it enabled, and the gratitude they felt toward the engineers and workers who had built their tanks. For men who had previously accepted that survival was largely chance, the jumbo provided something invaluable: control over their own fate, the ability to stand and fight, rather than simply hope to avoid being hit. The German military's response to the jumbo Sherman, or more precisely their inability to respond effectively, illuminated the broader collapse of Wehrmacht tactical and industrial capacity in the war's final months. The intelligence failure that left 88mm crews unaware of enhanced American armor was symptomatic of a military organization that had lost its ability to adapt to rapidly changing battlefield conditions. Captured German documents from early 1945 reveal an institution in denial. Training materials for anti-tank crews, even those produced in February and March, continued to list standard Sherman armor specifications. Gunnery tables provided no data for engaging heavily armored variants. Tactical directives assumed that 88mm guns retained their dominant position against all Allied armor. The institutional knowledge base, built on 3 years of successful employment, could not rapidly incorporate the new reality. Individual German units that encountered jumbos adapted through hard-won experience. After-action reports from formations that fought in the Ardennes or along the Rhine show evolving tactics, increased emphasis on flanking shots, coordination between multiple anti-tank weapons to strike simultaneously from different angles, and preference for ambush positions that allowed close-range engagement of side armor. But these lessons remained localized, shared informally between units rather than disseminated through official doctrine. The inability to respond at the industrial level was even more damaging. German tank designers were aware, through intelligence reports and interrogation of captured American crews, that upgraded Sherman variants existed. But by late 1944, German industry had lost the capacity for responsive innovation. Factories were under constant aerial bombardment. Raw materials were scarce. The labor force consisted increasingly of slave workers with little technical expertise and no motivation to maintain quality standards. Plans to upgrade the penetrating power of German anti-tank guns existed. The Pak-44, an even more powerful 88mm variant, was in development. Advanced ammunition types, including sophisticated armor-piercing composite rigid rounds, promised better performance against thick armor. But none of these improvements reached frontline units in meaningful quantities. The factories that should have been producing them were rubble. The rail networks that should have been distributing them were paralyzed by Allied air interdiction. This industrial paralysis meant that German anti-tank crews in March and April of 1945 were fighting with essentially the same weapons and ammunition they had used in 1943. The 88mm gun that had dominated battlefields for 3 years was now, in specific circumstances, against specific targets, inadequate. For Wehrmacht troops who had relied on technological superiority to offset numerical disadvantage, this represented a psychological catastrophe. German veteran accounts from the war's final months frequently mention encounters with American tanks that could not be destroyed from the front. The language is significant. Rather than identifying a specific tank variant, veterans described a general phenomenon, a breakdown in the reliable correlation between hitting and killing that had characterized earlier combat. This suggests that even crews who encountered jumbos never fully understood what they were facing, viewing it instead as random bad luck or equipment failure rather than a systematic American capability. The psychological impact extended beyond anti-tank crews. German infantry, whose willingness to hold defensive positions often depended on confidence that supporting 88mm guns could stop Allied armor, began to waver when that assumption proved unreliable. If American tanks could survive hits from the murder guns, if they could advance despite concentrated anti-tank fire, then defensive positions became traps rather than fortresses. This erosion of confidence contributed to the Wehrmacht's rapid disintegration in the West during March and April of 1945. Units that might have fought stubbornly in 1943 or 44, confident in their weapons and tactics, instead chose withdrawal or surrender. The jumbo's role in this collapse was indirect but measurable. It was not the armor itself that broke German resistance, but rather the realization that even Germany's most reliable weapons system could fail. Post-war German military analysis, conducted by former Wehrmacht officers working with American military historians, acknowledged the jumbo as a significant tactical surprise. Reports noted that the failure to identify and adapt to enhanced American armor represented a broader failure of German military intelligence and industrial responsiveness. The recognition that 254 tanks could create disproportionate psychological effects through surprise and local superiority influenced Cold War-era discussions of military deception and the importance of technological surprise. For the 88mm crews specifically, men like Oberfeldwebel Klaus Richter, who survived the war, the memory of rounds bouncing off Sherman hulls remained vivid decades later. In interviews conducted in the 1960s and 70s, veterans consistently described the shock and disbelief of watching their most reliable weapon fail. Some questioned whether they had been given defective ammunition. Others wondered if their guns had been sabotaged. The alternative, that American industry had quietly fielded superior armor in sufficient numbers to matter, challenged their understanding of the war they had fought. The jumbo thus became part of the broader narrative of German military decline, a symbol of how tactical excellence and superior equipment could be negated by industrial capacity, strategic surprise, and the cumulative effects of prolonged warfare. It was not a decisive weapon that changed the war's outcome, but it was a telling weapon that revealed how far German advantages had eroded, and how completely American industrial and tactical adaptation had closed gaps that once seemed insurmountable. The story of the jumbo Sherman concludes not with statistics or tactical analysis, but with the men who crewed them and the men who faced them. The 254 tanks produced between June and July of 1944 carried approximately 1,270 American tankers into combat. The majority survived the war, a survival rate dramatically higher than their counterparts in standard Shermans. This simple fact represents lives saved, families spared grief, futures that continued beyond 1945. Staff Sergeant William McVeigh, who held a crossroads near Bastogne for 6 hours while his jumbo absorbed 17 hits, returned to Pennsylvania after the war. He worked as a machinist for 37 years, raised 4 children, and rarely spoke of his combat experience. When he did, in interviews conducted in the 1980s, he focused not on heroism but on relief, the profound gratitude he felt for armor that protected him when protection had seemed impossible. His story was repeated hundreds of times. Jumbo crews returned home with a different psychological burden than their fellow tankers. They had survived not through luck or evasion, but through engineering and steel. The survivor's guilt that plagued many combat veterans was tempered by the knowledge that their protection had been real, their survival earned through American industrial capacity rather than random chance. This distinction, subtle but significant, affected how jumbo veterans processed their wartime experiences. The German crews who faced jumbos and survived carried different memories. The shock of watching rounds bounce, the moment when doctrine failed and training proved inadequate, remained traumatic. Some, like Klaus Richter, spent years questioning their own competence, wondering if they had somehow failed in that moment outside Krinkelt. Only decades later, when historians revealed the jumbo's specifications and limited production, did veterans understand that their weapons had not failed through defect or incompetence, but had simply encountered armor beyond their capacity to penetrate. This revelation brought its own psychological complexity, relief that they had not failed personally, mixed with bitterness at the intelligence failure that left them unprepared. The recognition that American industry could produce such tanks in quantities sufficient to matter, while German factories struggled to maintain production of existing designs, reinforced the narrative of inevitable defeat that many German veterans carried into peacetime. The jumbo's place in historical memory evolved over decades. Immediately post-war, it was overshadowed by the arrival of the M26 Pershing and the broader narrative of American armor development. Military histories published in the 1950s barely mentioned it, focusing instead on the mass-produced standard Sherman and the dramatic but limited Pershing deployments. The jumbo seemed a footnote, an interesting variant that appeared too late and in too few numbers to matter. This assessment shifted in the 1970s and 80s as historians gained access to German documents and conducted extensive interviews with veterans from both sides. The cumulative weight of accounts describing jumbo's surviving hits that should have been fatal, the tactical adaptations their presence forced, and the psychological impact they created led to reassessment. The jumbo emerged as a case study in how small numbers of superior equipment, properly employed and benefiting from surprise, could achieve effects disproportionate to their quantity. Modern armor historians recognize the jumbo as a transitional design, a bridge between the mass-produced medium tank philosophy that dominated American doctrine through 1944 and the heavy tank doctrine that would emerge in the Cold War. Its compromises, trading mobility for protection while retaining inadequate firepower, illustrated the difficulty of balancing the 3 fundamental characteristics of tank design, but its success in the role for which it was designed, absorbing fire and leading assaults, validated the concept of specialized variants within a common chassis family. The jumbo also serves as a reminder that technological surprise, even on a small scale, can create strategic effects. 254 tanks could not change the war's outcome, but they could change how battles unfolded, how crews fought, and how many men survived to go home. In the calculus of war, where individual lives often disappear into statistical aggregates, the jumbo represents something important, the recognition that protecting soldiers, even at the cost of other performance characteristics, was worth the industrial investment. The final jumbo combat action occurred in late April of 1945, as American forces pushed into southern Germany. A single jumbo from the 4th Armored Division, its hull scarred with dozens of impact marks accumulated over 9 months of combat, led a column into the town of Regensburg. German resistance was minimal. The war would end within 2 weeks. The crew, exhausted and emotionally numb, parked their tank in the town square and waited for orders that never came. The war simply ended around them. That jumbo survived the war intact. It was eventually shipped back to the United States, used briefly for training, and then scrapped in the 1950s as American armor doctrine moved toward newer designs. No complete original jumbo exists in museums today, though a few modified versions survive. The tanks that absorbed punishment meant to kill, that saved lives through steel and engineering, were cut apart and melted down, their metal recycled into peacetime products, but the memory persists. In the accounts of veterans who crewed them and faced them, in the after-action reports that documented their improbable survival, in the photographs that show Sherman silhouettes bearing impact marks that should have meant death. The jumbo Sherman was not the tank that won the war, but it was the tank that proved American armor could stand and fight, that protection was possible, and that industrial capacity, rapidly applied to urgent problems, could save lives even in war's final, desperate months. Back outside Krinkelt, on that December morning in 1944, Oberfeldwebel Klaus Richter watched the impossible Sherman's turret traverse toward his position. His crew was already preparing to displace, to relocate, and try again from a different angle. The 88mm gun that had never failed them had just failed twice. The doctrine that had sustained them for 3 years had shattered in 30 seconds. The war would continue for 5 more months, but in that moment, the certainty was gone. They had encountered something new, something their training had not prepared them for, something German intelligence had never warned them about. They had encountered 7 inches of American steel, and they had learned, too late, that the age of the 88's dominance was ending. The jumbo had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had survived, and in surviving, it had revealed a new truth about the war, that American industry, when focused and urgent, could produce armor equal to Germany's best. Not in overwhelming numbers, not soon enough to change the war's outcome, but enough to matter to the men who climbed inside those tanks and came home alive. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.